Everyone called him the ultimate American hero. So why did some of Hollywood's biggest legends quietly refuse to stand beside him? Behind the salute and swagger was a colder truth: contracts withdrawn, scripts rejected, friendships fractured by politics and pride. These weren't petty rivalries. They were ideological wars, hidden behind studio smiles. Tonight, we uncover the stars who drew a line in the sand and the buried reasons why. And one refusal changed everything. Marlon Brando. If John Wayne represented American certainty, Marlon Brando represented American doubt. And doubt was not something Wayne admired. Marlon Brando transformed screen acting in the 1950s. He internalized emotion. He exposed vulnerability. He allowed weakness to exist in men who would once have stood like monuments. That shift alone put him at odds with the rigid masculinity Wayne projected. But the deeper fracture was political. Brando supported civil rights activism. He spoke out against American militarism. He later refused his Academy Award for The Godfather to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. Wayne, in contrast, defended expansionist narratives and publicly made hardline statements about race and American power in his infamous 1971 Playboy interview. Their worldviews did not merely differ. They contradicted each other. There were industry murmurs about pairing the Duke and the method revolutionary in a Western during the late 1950s, a generational clash on screen. The concept was commercially irresistible. Brando showed no real interest. He was dismantling the myth Wayne embodied. Films like The Wild One and On the Waterfront questioned authority and explored alienation. Traditional Western archetypes, stoic sheriffs, unquestioned moral codes, felt emotionally artificial to him. Wayne, meanwhile, criticized what he saw as Hollywood drifting into cynicism and moral confusion. He viewed certain modern performances as indulgent, lacking discipline, lacking patriotism. Working together would have required one of them to compromise the core of what they believed cinema should be. Brando refused to legitimize mythic simplicity. Wayne refused to embrace existential ambiguity. So the collaboration never materialized. Not because of ego, because of ideology. Brando didn't need to publicly declare rejection. His career was an ongoing counterargument to Wayne's philosophy. Every conflicted character he played quietly rejected the rigid moral universe Wayne protected. Two icons, one industry, two incompatible Americas. And sometimes, the most powerful refusal isn't shouted across a room. It's lived across an entire career. Henry Fonda. They were close enough to argue without ending the friendship. Which is exactly why the refusal mattered. Henry Fonda and John Wayne vacationed together. Their families socialized. They respected each other's craft. On the surface, this should have produced at least one legendary collaboration. It never did. And that wasn't coincidence. Fonda was politically liberal, a Roosevelt Democrat who believed institutions should be questioned, not blindly defended. Wayne was fiercely conservative and unapologetically supportive of anti-communist investigations during the Red Scare. Their debates were famous in private circles. When studios floated prestige, westerns, and patriotic dramas that could unite them, discussions repeatedly cooled one's tone, and messaging entered the room. Fonda reportedly resisted scripts that leaned too heavily into ideological certainty. He preferred ambiguity, flawed heroes, conflicted decisions, moral complexity. Wayne preferred clarity. In one often cited remark, Wayne called Fonda the most un-American man in Hollywood. Not in a newspaper headline, not in a press feud, but in conversation. And he meant it. That line reveals everything, because while they remained friends socially, professionally, they drew a boundary. Fonda did not want his name attached to films that reinforced political messaging he disagreed with. That Wayne did not want to dilute the moral authority of his brand by pairing it with a man who openly challenged American institutions on screen. Producers eventually stopped pushing, not because schedules conflicted, because neither man would yield on tone. This wasn't a dramatic falling out. It was something quieter and colder, mutual refusal without public spectacle. They preserved the friendship, but they refused to share the myth. Kirk Douglas. This wasn't a personality clash. It was a collision of convictions. When Kirk Douglas made the decision to publicly credit blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo for Spartacus in 1960, he didn't just restore a name. He fractured an industry wall built on fear. The Hollywood blacklist had been defended by powerful figures who believed they were protecting American values from communist infiltration. One of those defenders was John Wayne. Wayne supported the House Un-American Activities Committee. He stood firmly against those he believed were undermining the country from within. In his view, the blacklist was not oppression, it was protection. Douglas believed it was cowardice. That ideological split wasn't subtle. It ran through studio corridors, dinner tables, casting rooms. Producers quietly floated the idea of pairing Douglas and Wayne in a major war epic during the late 1950s. Two powerful screen presences. Two symbols of American strength. But strength meant different things to each man. Douglas had fought to restore artistic freedom. Wayne had defended the purge of those he deemed dangerous. Sharing heroic space would have blurred those lines. Douglas wasn't interested in lending legitimacy to projects that echoed Wayne's hardline messaging. His later career leaned into morally complex characters, flawed leaders, conflicted warriors, men wrestling with conscience. Wayne preferred clarity, good and evil, loyalty and betrayal. Douglas thrived in gray. There were no explosive press conferences announcing refusal. There didn't need to be. The industry understood that collaboration would be volatile. Meetings stalled, scripts quietly shifted, other names filled casting slots. Douglas once described the blacklist era as a time when too many were afraid to stand up. Wayne never publicly expressed regret for supporting it. That difference mattered. Because acting together would have implied alignment, and neither man was willing to blur his stance for box office spectacle. Douglas didn't shout his refusal. He embodied it in the choices he made. In Hollywood, sometimes the loudest no is the project you never sign. Montgomery Clift. John Wayne believed heroes stood tall. Montgomery Clift believed heroes trembled. Clift's rise in the late 1940s and 1950s introduced a new kind of masculinity. Introspective, emotionally fragile, psychologically layered. His performances in A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity weren't about dominance. They were about inner fracture. Wayne openly resisted method acting techniques. He preferred instinct, posture, voice, strength projected outward. He viewed excessive emotional excavation as indulgent. That philosophical divide became professional. When a major Western concept surfaced, involving an aging frontier icon, mentoring a younger, troubled drifter, a role clearly tailored for Clift, the pairing generated interest. But insiders later noted that Wayne questioned whether Clift's style fit the heroic tone he envisioned. Clift, meanwhile, avoided projects that simplified moral stakes. He gravitated toward directors who encouraged vulnerability, not mythic certainty. The script quietly died in development. Not because of logistics, because Wayne wasn't willing to anchor a Western around a psychologically fragile co-lead. And Clift wasn't willing to flatten his emotional complexity to stand beside an unshakable symbol. This wasn't scheduling conflict. It was aesthetic rejection. Wayne didn't want to validate a new masculinity he believed weakened the genre. Clift didn't want to reinforce the rigidity he quietly deconstructed in every performance. So, they never stood together. And in that absence, you can see the handoff of Hollywood eras, one refusing to evolve, the other refusing to retreat. Humphrey Bogart. Two men defined American masculinity in the 1940s. Only one of them wore a cowboy hat. Humphrey Bogart didn't need Monument Valley to command a screen. He ruled smoky rooms, trench coats, and moral ambiguity. His heroes didn't wave flags, they navigated corruption. They distrusted power. They survived it. John Wayne was different. His characters believed in systems. In order, invisible strength. Their rivalry was never a shouting match. It was colder than that. During the late 1940s, the political tension inside Hollywood was tightening. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigations were underway. Wayne publicly supported anti-communist efforts. Bogart initially joined the committee for the First Amendment, a group pushing back against what they saw as overreach and intimidation during the hearings. That move didn't sit well with Wayne. Bogart later softened his stance publicly, but the damage to ideological trust was done. The industry read sides forming. Studios quietly explored the idea of pairing them in a prestige war drama, two hardened Americans facing a moral battlefield. The box office would have been unstoppable. But insiders knew it would be combustible. Bogart gravitated toward scripts layered with irony and moral doubt. Films like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca thrived on complexity. Wayne preferred narratives that resolved cleanly, virtue rewarded, betrayal punished. They were playing different emotional notes. There was also pride. Both were alphas. Both guarded their screen dominance. Bogart's authority came from contained intensity. Wayne's came from sheer presence. Sharing that space meant negotiating who led, and neither man was built to yield easily. Accounts from industry circles describe a mutual skepticism. Not hatred, not open hostility, just a firm understanding that their artistic philosophies clashed. Bogart reportedly found Wayne's political rigidity limiting. Wayne viewed certain Hollywood circles, which Bogart often moved within, as too sympathetic to liberal causes. The result? Scripts stalled. Meetings dissolved. Producers stopped pushing. The silence became strategic. By the time Bogart's health declined in the mid-1950s, the opportunity had faded entirely. Two giants, never in the same frame. It wasn't explosive. It was restrained, which somehow makes it sharper. Because when two of the era's most dominant men never share a screen, it tells you something about power lines beneath the glamour. And the next actor didn't just question Wayne's politics. He challenged the entire myth Wayne represented. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy built his reputation on restraint and moral reflection. John Wayne built his on conviction. That difference wasn't cosmetic. It was foundational. Tracy demanded layered scripts. He gravitated toward courtroom dramas and socially conscious narratives that examined prejudice, justice, and institutional responsibility. He preferred dialogue over declarations. Wayne preferred myth over meditation. When large-scale productions sought two commanding male leads, Tracy's name was occasionally mentioned alongside Wayne's. But early script discussions reportedly stalled over tone. Tracy resisted projects that presented unchallenged authority as inherently righteous. Wayne resisted projects that blurred moral lines. Privately, Tracy is said to have found some of Wayne's public rhetoric excessive. Wayne viewed Tracy's roles as emblematic of Hollywood drifting into moral ambiguity. Neither man publicly attacked the other. They simply refused to adjust. Tracy would not anchor a film that simplified justice into a slogan. Wayne would not anchor one that questioned patriotic certainty. Studios learned quickly. Pairing them meant negotiating ideology before camera placement. It wasn't worth the friction. So the pairing was quietly shelved. Not explosive, not scandalous, but deliberate. Clint Eastwood. This one isn't rumor. It's documented tension. When John Wayne saw High Plains Drifter, he didn't stay quiet. He reportedly told Eastwood the film wasn't what the West was about. He wasn't talking about history. He was talking about Clint Eastwood. He objected to its moral ambiguity. He disliked its portrayal of a town complicit in corruption. He felt it twisted the heroic code traditional Westerns were built on. To Wayne, the West stood for clarity law versus chaos, civilization versus savagery, strength used to preserve order. Eastwood's West was different, bleaker, dirtier, morally unstable. In High Plains Drifter, the so-called hero is closer to a ghost of vengeance than a defender of virtue. The town isn't innocent. Authority isn't clean. Justice isn't comforting. It's punishing. Wayne believed Westerns should uphold myth. Eastwood believed they should interrogate it. After criticizing the film, Wayne reportedly suggested that Eastwood should make a more traditional Western one that honored the foundational spirit of the genre, one that restored moral balance instead of eroding it. Eastwood didn't argue publicly. He didn't issue rebuttals. He simply continued making the films he wanted to make. That silence mattered, because at that moment, a collaboration was possible. Studios were aware of the symbolic power. The aging Duke and the rising successor sharing a frame would have been historic. It would have represented generational continuity. But continuity wasn't Eastwood's interest. He was evolving the Western into something reflective of post-Vietnam America, skeptical of institutions, distrustful of authority, aware that heroism can coexist with brutality. Wayne's worldview did not leave space for that moral grayness. To share the screen with Wayne in a traditional Western would have required Eastwood to recalibrate his tone, to soften the cynicism, to restore mythic simplicity. He chose not to. And that choice wasn't passive. It was strategic authorship. By the 1970s, Eastwood was directing and producing his own projects. He controlled narrative tone. He shaped endings. He determined what justice looked like. Aligning with Wayne's ideological framing would have meant surrendering some of that autonomy. He never did. Publicly, Eastwood remained respectful. He acknowledged Wayne's influence. Yet he recognized the Duke's monumental place in cinema history. Professionally, he moved in the opposite direction. Wayne defended the legend of the West. Eastwood exposed its fractures. Wayne's heroes stood firm against chaos. Eastwood's heroes often were the chaos or products of it. A joint film would have forced one of them to compromise. Neither man built a career on compromise. So they remained connected only by comparison mentor and successor in theory, ideological opposites in practice. Eastwood didn't attack Wayne. He didn't need to. He rejected the myth by rewriting it. And in doing so, he didn't just refuse to ride beside the Duke. He rode past him into a darker horizon the old mythology couldn't follow. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was not just an actor. He was an image. Carefully engineered, carefully protected, yet carefully controlled. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Hudson had become one of Hollywood's most bankable romantic leads. He was polished, elegant, emotionally accessible. Studios sold him as the ideal American man, charming, dependable, desirable. Every interview was curated, every public appearance calibrated. And behind that immaculate surface, his management team understood something critical. Stability was everything. John Wayne was not stability. Wayne was force. He was ideological gravity. By the 1960s and 70s, he was increasingly outspoken about politics, patriotism, Vietnam, race, and what he believed America should stand for. His public statements, particularly later in his career, were not subtle. They carried heat. They carried division. That heat was dangerous for a brand like Hudson's. When exploratory conversations surfaced about pairing Hudson and Wayne in a large-scale war drama, the idea initially seemed powerful. Two major stars. Two embodiments of American masculinity. It could have been box office gold. But behind closed doors, tone became the problem. Wayne's presence brought ideological weight to any production. His films were not just entertainment. They often carried overt messaging. Hudson's brand relied on emotional universality, charm, romantic vulnerability. He was accessible across political lines. Aligning him too closely with Wayne's hardline patriotic framing risked narrowing that audience. Hudson's representatives reportedly showed little enthusiasm, not hostility, caution, because association is alignment in Hollywood. And Wayne's increasingly vocal social positions made alignment a strategic liability for a carefully managed leading man whose public persona required smooth edges. There was also the matter of masculinity tone. Wayne projected dominance, moral certainty, frontier command. Hudson's appeal lay in emotional warmth, romantic sensitivity, and subtlety. Sharing a screen would have required tonal recalibration from one of them. Wayne did not recalibrate. Hudson's camp did not lean in. The project's interest evaporated before contracts ever became real. This wasn't creative incompatibility alone. It was brand protection. Studios in that era invested heavily in maintaining illusions. Hudson's personal life was tightly guarded in a Hollywood environment that punished deviation from carefully constructed norms. Any collaboration that pulled him into politically charged territory introduced unpredictability, and unpredictability was unacceptable. So the two never shared a frame beyond early talks. No press drama, no public rejection, just a quiet strategic retreat. Wayne continued building his myth. Hudson continued preserving his. That absence was not accidental. It was calculated avoidance, a refusal rooted not in personal animosity, but in survival. Because in old Hollywood, protecting the image sometimes mattered more than making the movie. Charlton Heston. On paper, it should have been inevitable. Charlton Heston and John Wayne shared the same granite presence, the same commanding voice, the same larger-than-life embodiment of American strength. Both men carried a patriotic aura that studios adored. Both projected certainty, authority, unmonumental conviction. So why did they never truly ride into battle together? Because similarity can be combustible. Studios loved the optics. Two titans united in epic Americana, a sweeping war film, a grand frontier saga, a Civil War epic with equal billing. The posters would have been seismic, two silhouettes dominating the horizon. But early conversations exposed the fault line. Neither man was built to be second. Heston, especially after Ben-Hur and El Cid, operated as the moral center of his films. His characters were destiny-driven leaders, prophets, commanders, men whose final speech defined the story. He respected directors deeply and insisted on script integrity. He believed in structure, in classical storytelling discipline. Wayne, particularly in the later phase of his career, increasingly shaped projects around his worldview. He influenced casting. He influenced tone. He influenced ideological framing. His screen presence bent narratives toward him, almost by gravity alone. When scripts circulated requiring shared billing, questions surfaced quickly. Who delivers the final stand? Who anchors the moral authority? Whose ideology defines the conflict? In Hollywood, those are not cosmetic details. They are power structures. There was no explosive argument, no public criticism, no headline-worthy feud. There didn't need to be. Industry insiders have long noted that negotiations cooled once creative control entered the room. Heston was not interested in orbiting another man's myth. Wayne was not inclined to dilute his. Even their political similarities didn't guarantee harmony. While both were patriotic, Heston's public evolution included visible support for civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Wayne's rhetoric on race and American expansionism was far more rigid and controversial. That nuance mattered. Heston navigated prestige dramas examining moral scale and historical consequence. Wayne gravitated toward films reinforcing mythic clarity and frontier resolve. Two monumental identities, one screen. Someone would have had to yield narrative dominance. Neither did. So the project stalled, quietly, efficiently, not because they disliked one another, because neither titan would stand slightly behind the other when the camera rolled. That isn't simple incompatibility. It's a deliberate refusal to surrender mythic ground. And in old Hollywood, control over myth was everything. James Stewart. James Stewart didn't need to pretend to be brave. He had already proven it. Before he returned to Hollywood superstardom, James Stewart flew combat missions during World War II. He rose to the rank of brigadier general in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. His patriotism wasn't a script. It wasn't wardrobe. It was documented in military records. John Wayne, meanwhile, became the cinematic face of American courage. On screen, he stormed beaches, commanded cavalry charges, and embodied national certainty. To millions of viewers, he was the soldier, even though he had not served in the war itself. That contrast lingered in the background of Hollywood. It was rarely discussed publicly, but it was understood. Studios occasionally floated the idea of pairing the two men in a major war film or large-scale Western, and the marketing would have written itself, America's real war hero beside its greatest screen legend. Yet the collaborations never advanced beyond early conversations. Why? Because the comparison would have been unavoidable. Stewart's authority came from lived experience. When he played soldiers in post-war films, there was a quiet authenticity in his posture, in his restraint, in the way he carried moral weight. His westerns with director Anthony Mann, films like Winchester 73 and The Naked Spur, introduced a darker psychology into the genre. His characters were haunted, sometimes obsessive, often morally compromised. Wayne's westerns operated differently. His heroes were anchored, decisive, rarely fractured by doubt. He represented mythic stability, the idea that America, at its core, remained certain and strong. Pairing Stewart's introspective intensity with Wayne's declarative confidence would have created tonal friction, and there was also something subtler. Stewart avoided ideological spectacle. He did not aggressively enter political battles. He did not build his public persona around cultural confrontation. Wayne, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, stepped directly into political discourse. He defended controversial positions openly. He produced The Green Berets, an unapologetic pro-Vietnam War film. Stewart's patriotism was quieter. Wayne's was performative and public. A joint film would have drawn attention not only to their artistic differences, but to their real-world biographies. One man had worn the uniform in combat. The other had worn it in Technicolor. Even without criticism, the comparison would have lived in every review. So Stewart chose distance, not dramatically, not with a press statement, but with selection. He gravitated toward projects that examined inner fracture, not national slogans. He protected the integrity of his image by avoiding situations that might reduce his service to a cinematic contrast. Because sometimes refusal isn't about personal dislike. It's about legacy management. And Stewart understood that sharing the screen with the Duke would have reshaped how audiences measured both men. So he never stepped into that frame. Paul Newman. This wasn't scheduling conflict. It was principle. Paul Newman openly supported anti-Vietnam movements and progressive causes during the exact period John Wayne was producing and starring in The Green Berets, a film that aggressively defended U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. And Newman publicly opposed that war. Wayne publicly promoted it. That alone made collaboration radioactive. Wayne once criticized what he called Hollywood's anti-American drift. Newman's name later appeared on President Nixon's enemies list because of his political activism. They were not quietly different. They stood on opposing cultural barricades. There were serious studio discussions in the late 1960s about pairing them in a generational Western, a fading frontier hero, and a sharp, younger challenger. Newman showed no enthusiasm. According to industry accounts, he was unwilling to attach himself to projects that reinforced messaging he fundamentally disagreed with. Newman chose Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, a Western that romanticized outlaws and questioned authority instead of traditional patriotic narratives. That choice was not accidental. Wayne believed cinema should uphold American ideals. Newman believed cinema should question them. Newman didn't need to issue a press release saying, "I refuse." His career trajectory did it for him. When repeatedly presented with opportunities to stand beside Wayne's brand of America, he declined to step into that frame. And in Hollywood, that kind of refusal speaks loudly. He was the symbol of American certainty, yet behind the salute stood silence, distance, and doors that never opened. These weren't petty rivalries. They were ideological fault lines running through old Hollywood's polished facade. Contracts dissolved, scripts vanished, partnerships quietly died before cameras rolled. And if this is what happened in public, imagine what stayed buried in studio vaults. Because the Duke's greatest battles weren't always on horseback, some were fought in whispers.